These things have gotten too, okay, a lock, a line. What am I doing wrong? Ooh, sorry. I think I just didn't hit power. Okay, it's fine. Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna, there we go, I got it. Hi everyone, I'm Saffitz. I'm here in the NYT Cooking studio with another episode of Try This at Home. Today I'm making a recipe for classic cinnamon rolls. These to me are my ideal cinnamon roll. They have a defined swirl, delicious cream cheese icing on top, and this to me is a recipe that should be sort of in everybody's back pocket. It's not super technical, so it's friendly even for sort of non-bakers or beginners, and there's not a single person that will not love one of these cinnamon rolls. I think cinnamon rolls are part of almost everybody's cooking lexicon. It's something that people start making out of the can. Hopefully this will help people graduate into homemade, because I think the point of this recipe is that these are superior in texture, flavor, and have that really classic look. It's just really fun, and I think it's going to be better than, I don't want to say every cinnamon roll you've ever made or eaten, but they're really, really good. So the first step in the process, obviously, is to make the dough. With any kind of breakfast baking, especially if it's yeasted, I always think it's nice to be able to set it up the night before so you can bake in the morning without having to spend several hours of prep. So this dough is designed to be made the night before, and then you're gonna chill it overnight. It also benefits the dough to have that nice, long, cold rest. It improves flavor. It improves texture, and it also makes the dough just easier to handle. The first thing I'm gonna do is kind of an old-fashioned step called scalding. And what scalding does is it actually denatures some of the proteins in the milk, and it's those proteins that will inhibit gluten production as I'm mixing the dough. So this basically helps the dough to develop faster, more effectively, and that's gonna lead to improved texture in the dough. I feel like a lot of times with cinnamon buns, anything where you have a kind of yeasted sweet dough, they tend to be more crumbly and a little bit drier than I want them to be. So all of these little steps that you're gonna see me do for the dough are in service of improving that texture. So when you're scalding, you don't wanna let it come to a boil. And milk is one of those things where if you have it under high heat, it can boil really quickly and then boil up and out, and then you make a mess. So keep an eye on it. There's a lot of visual cues for when you're at that point just under boiling. You'll see the little ring of bubbles, the kind of rippling under the surface. We're gonna hold it at that temperature for about a minute. And now I'm gonna measure out 1/3 of a cup of the hot milk. So just right into my measuring cup. You can see it's steaming. That's another good sign. I have the dough hook on here. I know that a stand mixer is a big, pretty expensive piece of equipment. But for a dough like this, where we're going for full gluten development, it's just the best tool for the job. So I have my saucepan here with the remaining 2/3 cup milk. It's still off the heat. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a portion of the total flour in the recipe. So this is 1/4 cup. I'm going to add this to the milk, and I'm gonna make this roux-like mixture where I'm gonna cook the flour, and it's gonna do this step called pre-gelatinization of the starches. And when that gets added to the dough, it really increases the ability of the dough to hold onto moisture. I think this is kind of the most important step in developing this dough that's gonna stay really soft. So you wanna whisk really vigorously to work out any lumps, but if there are lumps, it's not a big deal because it's the action of the stand mixer that will help smooth everything out. Okay, so I'm gonna turn this back onto medium heat, and I just wanna cook this mixture, whisking constantly, and if you can, try to get into the crevices of the saucepan so that nothing scorches. And you can see it's already quite thick. You can see that all of the starches in the flour are kind of really thickening the mixture. And there's not a super defined endpoint. You're just cooking it until the mixture is really, really thick and pasty. And the descriptor that I give is that it looks basically like smooth mashed potatoes. It kind of holds its shape off the end of the whisk there. So it's this nice, thick, kind of pasty mixture. And now I'm also gonna scrape this into my stand mixer. So now we have our hot milk and our hot roux mixture in here. The problem with that is I actually wanna start with a cool mixture, and that's because a dough of this style, kind of similar to brioche, requires a really long, intensive mixing period. And that mixing is gonna generate friction, and it's gonna warm up the dough, and we don't want that to happen. So I had to cool this down. To this, I'm going to add 1/4 cup of ice cold water. And I'm adding water not only to cool it down, but I think that the addition of water really does help with gluten development. If the only liquid in the recipe is milk and eggs, you just have a harder time reaching that full gluten development stage. Then I have 3 eggs cold from the fridge. You're probably used to seeing recipes say like room temperature eggs. Like in a cake recipe, really important, but here I actually want them cold. So I'm gonna crack my 3 eggs in here as well. Then I'm just gonna give all of this a whisk. It doesn't have to be smooth. I just wanna get it all incorporated so that the temperature sort of equalizes. The next step is to actually go ahead and feel the side of your bowl. It might either be cool, like room temperature, or a little bit warm to the touch. So this bowl is a little bit warm. So I'm actually going to chill this briefly, probably just 5 to 10 minutes in the fridge, just so I can get that last bit of warmth out of the mixture. And I know I'm starting with something that's at the very least room temp. So I'm gonna chill this briefly, and then we'll come back and mix everything. Okay, I'm gonna grab the bowl. And the next step is to mix. So I'm going to add my flour. I'm using all-purpose flour. You might find recipes that call for bread flour. I want that balance between light and bready. And so I think all-purpose has enough protein content that you're still gonna get that good gluten development. I just don't want it to be too bready. So all-purpose is a good choice here. So I'm gonna add this to the bowl. I'm also gonna add my yeast. So I'm adding a teaspoon of active dry yeast. I usually call for active dry because it's so widely available. Dedicated bakers tend to use instant a lot more. It tends to be a little bit more reliable. Use whatever you're comfortable with. Either way, a teaspoon is good. And if you have made a lot of yeasted recipes before, you might recall that you have to do a step called proofing the yeast, which is where you dissolve it in some more water. Often there's like a little bit of sugar added so that you can start to see some activity in the yeast. This is a step that I basically largely skip now, unless I'm really unsure about the quality of the yeast. It's just not necessary. With active dry yeast and this much mixing, it's going to get dissolved, it's gonna get incorporated, and I actually don't want it to be too active from the start. I'm gonna continue to mix until basically all of the flour is incorporated. So I'm just gonna mix for a few minutes, and low speed is really important. It's not only better for the mixer, because sometimes it can strain if you like increase that speed against the dough, but it's also better for the development of the dough itself. Okay, so this has come together. All I want to accomplish at this stage is to have the liquid completely absorbed, all of the flour hydrated. And now I'm going to actually cover the bowl and let this just sit for 5 minutes. So this mixing process actually occurs in 3 stages. So that's the first. We're gonna come back for the second stage and add our sugar and our salt. And then the third stage is butter. Okay, so after a 5-minute rest, we can uncover it. And now I'm going to add my salt and my sugar. The reason I didn't add these from the beginning is that both of these things can inhibit gluten development. So I wanted a chance for the flour to absorb all the liquid and really hydrate to sort of kickstart that gluten development before I added these. And you're gonna see a pretty dramatic transformation in the texture. So I'm gonna add my salt and my sugar. And now I'm going to turn this on low-ish speed. We're gonna mix this until the dough is smooth, elastic, kind of pulling away from the sides of the bowl. And what I love about this is that it still bakes up really tender and light, but it still has that breadiness that we want. And gluten development isn't about making something tough or chewy in this case, it's about making something that is going to effectively trap all the gas produced by the yeast so that they bake up super light. So it might seem a little counterintuitive that we're developing a dough this much, but it's actually gonna help make it lighter. So this has been mixing actually closer to 20 minutes because we got lots of conversation during the break, but I'll show you what it looks like. The texture has really smoothed out, and more than anything, it's super elastic. So that's really what you want. So if I were to take the hook off, you can see that it has this really nice elasticity. See how it's not breaking when it stretches down the hook. So that's a really nice kind of endpoint for this stage of mixing. First, I'm just gonna scrape everything down for a second. If you don't have a bowl scraper, you can just use a flexible spatula, but I really do recommend them. They're so handy and very inexpensive. So now for the final mixing stage, we're gonna add the butter, but I don't wanna add it all at once. I wanna incorporate it little by little so that the dough has a chance to absorb it and it kind of emulsifies in. So I have 1 stick of butter here cut into pieces. And it is, I would say, cool room temperature. So that's really important. Again, this dough has been mixing for so long. All of that friction does cause it to warm up. If we were adding like super room temperature butter to slightly warm dough, it'll just kind of melt. So I'm gonna turn the mixer back on low and just add the butter a piece at a time. I like to kind of throw it into the bottom of the bowl. And go ahead and let it completely incorporate before you add the next piece. Don't rush this stage. And what might happen, especially if your butter is a little bit on the warmer side, the dough might like break into pieces. If like a little bit breaks off and then it gets coated in the butter and then it doesn't quite incorporate back into the like central mass, that's fine. Just keep mixing, it will eventually absorb. So you can add more. If your butter is so cold that it breaks apart when you smush it, it's a little too cold. So let it sit at room temp. But I would say that if you pulled your butter out at that sort of beginning phase of mixing, so it's sitting out during the rest and then the 20-minute mix, you're probably in good shape. You just want to go until everything's totally absorbed. I might probably scrape down the sides a little bit, but we're almost done. So I have a bowl here, a separate large bowl. You could just use the same mixing bowl and like take the dough out, clean it, butter it, but I'm gonna butter this bowl separately. This guy, just gonna keep my hand right here. We've given this mixer a workout. I have my hand on it. I do like to sometimes monitor because I have burned out more than one mixer. There is. That's not good, but that is again why we keep it on low. This mixer can very easily handle this amount of dough on low speed. It's when you start to increase it that either it starts to smoke or the whole thing. I've also had a mixer walk off the counter. That was also really bad. Okay, so I think I'm gonna give it a scrape. The butter looks pretty incorporated, which I think we're good. We're good to transfer it. So I'm gonna scrape this out onto my work surface. I just wanna gather this into a ball, and that's gonna be better for the dough as it rises. It's not sticky. There's sort of a tackiness to it. And you can see that at this temperature and at this stage in the process, it would be pretty hard to roll this out and fill it. So that's why that chilling is really useful. Again, not only does it improve flavor and texture, it also just makes the dough a lot easier to handle. So it firms it up. All that butter that's in there that's now kind of soft is gonna also firm up and make it just much easier to roll out and fill. I'm gonna put it into my greased bowl. So we're gonna let this rise now at room temperature before we put it in the fridge, but we're only gonna let it rise until it's about 50% larger. If you've made recipes with active dry yeast before, you'll very often see like doubled in size. We don't actually wanna go that far because when we put it into the fridge, it's gonna continue its rise. So we're just gonna let it hang out at room temperature. The yeast is going to start to like generate gas and kind of feed on everything, and this is sort of that fermentation phase. And then after about an hour, hour and a half, depending on the temperature of your kitchen, it'll be 50% expanded in size, and then it goes into the fridge overnight. So it's day 2. Now I'm gonna make the filling. And the secret ingredient in the filling are Biscoff cookies. I love the idea of incorporating an ingredient that has a lot of substance to it and has like mass and volume, rather than just filling it with sugar to get that like really defined kind of dark swirl. And of course, Biscoff cookies are like so delicious. It's like what you get on a Delta flight. They're like spicy and have cinnamon in them, and it's just like a flavor that I really want in my cinnamon roll. So I'm gonna start by pulverizing the cookies in my food processor. You could do this by hand. Basically like put the cookies into a plastic bag, press out the air, seal it, and bash them with a rolling pin. That's fine. The food processor is so fast and it does it so evenly, so I do kind of prefer it. I like using demerara sugar a lot because you get some of the sort of like caramelly flavor of brown sugar, but you still get the more granular texture. Then kosher salt. This is a really important, bringing out the flavor of all of the ingredients. Seasons it well. Again, it's not really overly sweet, so salt is there to kind of compensate as a flavor enhancer. And then a tablespoon of ground cinnamon. Use something fresh. If you've had cinnamon from the grocery store that's been sitting in your pantry for 3 years, it's probably time to get a new jar. You just want it to be fresh so you get that really kind of intense cinnamon flavor. Okay, I don't think it's gonna work. Nope, I knew it. What the hell is wrong with this thing? What am I doing wrong? Ooh, sorry. I think I just didn't hit power. Okay, it's fine. Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna, there we go, I got it. Even with my one at home, I'm like, it's never aligned right. So I'm just pulsing this. What you don't want to do is turn it into cookie butter. So you don't want to go to the point where it starts to get kind of wet. At the same time, you want it finely ground enough that you're not getting like big distinctive pieces of the cookie, which you would then be able to discern in the final recipe. Okay, so that looks good. Let's take a look. So here I have this really nice, uniform, finely ground mixture. And once I mix it with the butter and it goes into the buns, it really kind of disappears and you get this cohesive kind of filling. And now I'm gonna add my butter. So I have 12 tablespoons or a stick and a half of unsalted butter. And this is very room temperature. In this case, you want this to be nice and spreadable because I want to incorporate it into my cinnamon mixture. So I'm gonna add that. And then just using a flexible spatula, kind of mash them together. When it's all well mixed, you'll have this smooth, spreadable paste. So this is my filling. I'm gonna set that aside, kind of clear off my work surface, get a little bit of flour for rolling out, and I'm gonna grab the dough. So before I grab my dough out of the fridge, I do wanna prep the pan and butter a piece of foil, and that's just because I want the dough to be as cold as possible when I go to roll it out, and I don't want it to warm up as I'm prepping for the rest of the recipe. So I have a 13x9 pan here. Most 13x9 pans that I think people have at home are probably glass. I would suggest investing in an aluminum pan. Metal is just a better conductor. It helps you get more even baking, and I think for cinnamon rolls it's especially important because in glass you tend to get some over baking where like the sides and the bottom will dry out a little bit before the center is done. So metal is really preferred. I have some room temp butter here. Butter the bottom and sides. Now I have a piece of parchment paper. The width of the parchment is the same length as the pan. So I'm gonna use this to line the bottom and the two longer sides. So I'm just gonna press that into the bottom of the pan. And I always really like to smooth it in and eliminate any air bubbles. And then I'm just gonna butter the parchment. Okay, so our pan is done. I'm gonna set this aside. And now I'm gonna butter a piece of foil. So go ahead and tear off a piece of foil big enough to cover your entire pan. And then you're gonna go ahead and butter it just like a surface area that is about the same size as the pan. This is because we're gonna bake them covered for half of the bake time. And I don't want the tops of the buns, if they touch the foil, to stick. You don't have to be too generous about it, but that looks pretty good. And now I have a little bit of bench flour here. I have a rolling pin. I have a small offset spatula. This is gonna be for spreading my filling. And then importantly, I have, this is actually fishing line. You could use unflavored dental floss, you could use baker's twine. So the point is that you want a really thin, kind of sturdy piece of string, because that's what we're gonna use to cut the buns. And it makes just like the most perfect even spiral. I'm all set. I'm gonna grab my dough from the fridge and I'm gonna show you how to roll it out and form the buns. So here is the dough. This has been chilling. This was made yesterday. It has this beautiful dome. It has grown quite a bit. And when it went into the fridge, it was just about 50% expanded in size. And you can see that as it chilled, it continued to rise. And that's because the inside of the dough sort of holds onto that heat, and yeast sort of fermentation slows down at fridge temp, but in that period where the dough is cooling down, it's still kind of continuing to grow. It's filled with air, so it's kind of puffy, but it's also like nice and firm because it's cold. So I'm going to roll this out. And the first thing I'm gonna do, just with my hands, is to kind of press it out and begin to work it into a rectangular shape, because the dough was in kind of a sphere, and that means that the gluten was kind of oriented in this more like round kind of matrix, and I want to get it into something more rectangular. And when I'm doing this, I'm also sort of forcing out some of that gas that built up. And that's what you want to do when you're using active dry yeast, because you want that yeast to sort of come into contact with like new food sources so that when it goes for the second rise, it gets nice and puffy and active. So whenever I'm working dough into a rectangle, I tend to really like tug on the four corners to try to exaggerate those, because as you roll it out, it does want to round a little bit. So especially if you're in a warm kitchen, you want to try to work with like some focus here, because you don't want the dough to warm up too much. So I'm going to go in with my rolling pin and I'm going to start working this into a rectangle, and I'm going to roll it out into a slab that's like almost a 1/4 inch thick, sort of between 1/4 and 3/8. Anything around there is good. And the dimensions are not like super exact, but it's gonna be something around 12 or 13 wide and 20 inches long. I mean, this is not a particularly sticky dough, especially when it's cold, but you do wanna make sure that you're dusting it with adequate flour to prevent sticking. So I like giving it kind of a turn here and there. You just don't want to do too much flour. So if you have excess flour, go ahead and wipe that away. You can see it rolls out so beautifully. It's just really smooth, and it's because we developed all of that gluten that the dough is not really even springing back. Again, part of the reason why we gave it a nice long cold rest. Is there a ruler? Is there one in here? Oh, I got it. Okay, ruler, amazing, thank you. I was making something last night at home, and I used a ruler, and I was thinking that I should write a book called Baking with a Ruler, because I do use a ruler a lot. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and fill the dough. So I have my filling here, and I'm just gonna kind of dollop it across the dough. And then I'm gonna go in with my small offset spatula and spread it around into an even layer. So I'm gonna leave a little bit of a clean border along the 3 sides, but I can go right to the edge of that long side closest to me. It's not a difficult thing to spread at all. The butter is soft, and actually the little bits of cookie are almost like little ball bearings. It's like they do glide pretty easily. So it might seem like you don't have enough, but just keep spreading. You should be good. Okay, and now it's time to roll it up. So I'm gonna start at that long edge closest to me. I think it's easier to kind of roll away from yourself. And I'm just gonna start. Sometimes what I do, especially if during that spreading process, I feel like the dough has contracted a little bit, I'll give it like a little tug toward myself before I fold it over. I think it just helps to kind of start to build a little bit of tension in the roll. You want tension, but not too much, because as I said, if you roll it too tightly, sometimes you'll get like filling leaking out. But if you roll it too loose, then you just don't get a roll that's as well formed. And then I like to just kind of move from one end to the other. Okay, so once you get to the end, you're gonna let it rest on that seam. So it's gonna rest right on that longer side where I don't have any dough, and that's gonna help it seal. So if it's feeling a little bit soft at this stage and it's becoming hard to handle, you're gonna wanna chill this roll before you cut your cinnamon rolls. So what I would do is transfer it to a piece of parchment paper, slide that parchment onto a rim baking sheet, and just throw it in the fridge or even the freezer if you can fit it for like 5 to 10 minutes. But this still feels cool to the touch, so I think I'm good to go. So what I like to do is just kind of squeeze along the length and lengthen it out a little bit, make it a little bit longer so that I'm evening out the thickness. And that just means I'm gonna cut buns that are all even sizes. The first thing I'm gonna do is just trim off the end. Slide it under this edge, maybe about a 1/2 inch in or so. Bring the ends together and cut. I'm gonna do that here as well. Here's the part where it's like not super precise, because I wanna cut 15 buns because I think that's really the right number to fit into my 13x9 pan in a 3x5 grid. So it's a little bit hard. Like 16 is a lot easier to cut than 15 because you can just go in half, in half, in half, and then in half again to do the math. With 15, it's a little trickier because it's an odd number, but my best recommendation is to divide it into thirds and then cut each third into 5. And you can use the string and the ruler to kind of help you mark it out. I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it. So I'm going to cut. Then same thing on this side. Okay, and now each one of these into fifths. So for the fifths, I really do like to kind of mark out where I'm gonna cut. And so you can see the whole point of using a piece of string like this is that I'm not compressing or flattening the roll at all. I'm getting a cut that is like perfectly preserving that spiral, which looks so good. As I cut, I'm gonna 1 by 1 place them inside my pan. Again, working in a 3x5 grid. You can see the spiral looks so good. Everything looks so good. I would say they're mostly equal in size. Some are a little bit smaller, some are a little bit taller, but that's okay. What happens as they bake is that they kind of like touch each other and encourage each other to rise up and get really nice and puffy. I'm going to cover them buttered side down, obviously. These are going to now rise at room temperature. This is their second rise. And I want them to go until they are almost, but not quite doubled in size. So we want really like puffy, fluffy, light cinnamon rolls. If I were to let them fully double in size at room temp before baking, what ends up happening is they actually kind of go a little bit too far and start to lose volume in the oven. And that's when you get the gaps between the spiral. And I don't want that. I want like a nice full, not deflated cinnamon roll. So the buns have been proofing for about 45 minutes. I should mention that my oven is preheated to 350, and we can just sort of peek under the foil. They look so good. They've definitely puffed up. They are starting to kind of touch like at all points. And I want to just kind of show you a good test to know if your dough is proofed. You can give it a little poke, and you want to look to see that the dough springs back slowly but holds a little bit of an indentation from your finger. So that's basically an indication that it has like a nice amount of gas in there, and the dough is also pretty relaxed. Another good tip, by the way, take a picture with your phone, and then you have a record of what they looked like when they first went into the pan, and then you can do like a side-by-side comparison. Okay, so these are ready to go. I'm gonna take the foil and put it back over, and this time I'm going to seal it pretty tightly. That is going to help them achieve what we call maximum oven spring, so like getting that last bit of rise as they go into the oven. All the gases kind of expand as they heat up, and it's also gonna trap steam, so it's gonna keep them really moist. There won't be a lot of moisture loss in the beginning of baking. Make sure you're going butter side down on the foil again. Now into the oven at 350, and I'm gonna set my timer for 15 minutes, and then at the 15-minute mark, I'm gonna remove the foil. This is a cream cheese icing. I just feel like the buns, there's not that much sugar in it. There's a half cup in the filling, only a quarter cup in the dough itself. And I think it really welcomes this added sweetness from this cream cheese icing. And I just think there is not a single, is there like any recipe in the baking realm that is loved more than cream cheese frosting or icing? I don't think so. And I'm gonna use a flexible spatula just to work this together and get all of that sugar incorporated. And what happens is the sugar is gonna kind of draw out a lot of the moisture in the cream cheese and thin out the consistency a little bit. So it'll become a lot looser. You could absolutely do this in the stand mixer with the paddle. There's just an ease, I think, of just kind of doing it all in one bowl without the mixer. Starting with that room temperature cream cheese means that all this comes together really easily. Okay, so I have this smooth mixture, and now I'm gonna add 6 tablespoons of room temperature butter. And then same thing, I'm just gonna work this in with my spatula. It blends super easily. So once you have the butter pretty well incorporated, I'm actually now gonna switch to my whisk because I wanna fluff it up a little bit and incorporate a little bit of air, lighten it up. I'm just gonna whisk it until it's thickened a little bit, it's paled a little bit, so it's lighter. Okay, anyway, this is my frosting now. This is all set. See, it comes together really, really easily. And I'm just gonna set this aside. We need to wait until our cinnamon rolls are cooled, but looks pretty good. First of all, they smell so good. That's a really good indicator that they're done baking, is that your whole kitchen smells like a Cinnabon. They look great. I don't really want more color on them than what I have. Just kind of a light golden brown is really nice because I don't want them to dry out too much. And we're gonna cover them with icing anyway. We do need to let them cool. This part's kind of hard, but you wanna let them cool off, but they look and smell so good. The first thing I want to do actually is slide this parchment paper out from under the rolls. It's like the tablecloth. If I try to, it sort of worked. It didn't really work. This is the most fun part of the whole recipe. I am just going to spread this in a nice even layer across the entire surface. A little bit of it behind. Can I eat this part? I want to eat it so bad. Okay. All right, so I pulled out the corner piece, which I love because you get so many different textures. You get like just the faintest layer of crispiness around the edge, the kind of buttery, almost caramelized bottom. It is so fun to like unravel them. I guess unravel is the word I'm looking for. It's really hard to pick a best part. I think you have to kind of eat it all together. Like, yes, you can lick the frosting off the top, but I don't know why you would make these and not put cream cheese icing on it. It's so good. It's just a fun recipe overall, one that I hope you try at home, kind of the point of this show. But we do have more to show you, I think, of more sort of equally makeable recipes that I think you'll really love. So thank you so much for watching.